Well, welcome, folks. We want to talk today about climate. Climate. It's actually kind of a controversial topic because, at least in our day and age, a lot of people are talking about climate change. And we're going to address that a little bit later in a later podcast about the issue of climate change, what causes it, is it happening? We'll deal with that sort of more controversial thing. But today we want to just learn about kind of what is climate and how does it affect our world. So, yeah, that's where we're headed. So let's get at it. All right. First of all, what is climate? Well, climate is the average weather over time. So, when we think there's a big difference between weather and climate. We talked about this in a previous podcast, but let's, we're talking about average weather over time. So, usually actually the time span is typically thought of about 30 years. So what's the average weather where you live for the past 30 years? Is there an average? And what is that average? And so that's what climate is, okay? Typically 30 years. So let's do a quick little video clip that'll talk about what climate is.
There are other factors besides the sun that determine climate. In some places, the weather stays warm year-round, while in other parts of the world, it is cold all the time. One reason for this is latitude. Latitude is the distance a place lies north or south of the equator, measured by imaginary lines called lines of latitude. There are 5 latitude lines geographers use in discussing climate. The first one is the equator. Places located near the equator receive large amounts of sunlight all year round and are warmer than other places on Earth. 23.5 degrees north of the equator is a line of latitude called the Tropic of Cancer. When the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun, sunlight falls directly along this line. When the southern hemisphere is facing the sun, sunlight falls upon another line, located 23.5 degrees south of the equator, called the Tropic of Capricorn. Areas of the world located between these two lines are called the low latitudes or the tropics. South of the Tropic of Capricorn, at 66.5 degrees south latitude, is a line of latitude called the Antarctic Circle. Another line, called the Arctic Circle, is located north of the Tropic of Cancer at 66.5 degrees north latitude. The areas between the tropics and these two lines are called the middle latitudes. The sun never shines directly on these areas, so places located here are cooler than in the tropics. The middle latitudes are also known as the temperate regions. North of the Arctic Circle and south of the Antarctic Circle are the high latitudes, or polar regions. These areas receive the least amount of sunlight, so places here are very cold. In fact, for half the year, these areas get no sunlight at all.
Well, hopefully that kind of helped clarify what climate is, and we can move on there. So let's talk about temperature and climate here. So there's actually 2 main things that influence climate. 2 things, that's right, 2 things. 2 things, there's just a 2. What do you think they are? Is it red and white? No. No. It's something other than colors. What do you think it is? My computers. The first one is moisture. That's right. You see, moisture, if there is moisture, that affects climate. Notice here we have a picture of a desert. It's very dry in the desert. Or if you go here to a tropical rainforest. You see, these 2 places might be in sort of the same place. But you see, they have totally different amounts of moisture, so they have a completely different climate.
Another important aspect of a region's climate is the amount of precipitation that falls. In some places, it rains or snows nearly every day. Other places may be completely dry for most of the year, with rain coming only in certain months, like during the monsoon season in India.
So moisture is one thing, and the other one is temperature. So if it's very cold, like here in the Arctic, that's going to have one effect, or if it's very hot on this desert island. You see, so the two main players in the issue of climate is temperature and moisture. Got it? What is it? That's right, temperature and moisture. All right, now here's where we're going to get at this. Okay, so let's take a look at the factors. We've got three main factors about temperature, at least for temperature. How are we going to affect temperature? The first thing is latitude. Okay, that means, of course, when you go north or south of the equator, go north latitude or south latitude. So, definition of latitude is the measure of the distance north or south of the equator. Okay, and you probably know this. The further you get away from the equator, the colder the temperature gets. The lowest temperatures, of course, are found in the north and in the south poles. Now, that's sort of a duh thing, but if you're going to have some kind of a climate that has something to do with how far north or south you are. The second thing has to do with elevation, and that's particularly cogent to where we live here in Woodland Park. So if you live in a mountainous region, then that has an effect, right? Elevation is just how far above sea level something is, right? Now, what's the effect? Of course, the higher you go, the colder it gets. And I'll talk some more about that later. All right, and so that's going to have an effect on temperature too, isn't it? All right, what about ocean currents? An ocean current, now we've talked about this in the previous section. Ocean currents, of course, are rivers of water. And those rivers of water in the ocean, rivers of water in the ocean. Now these affect, it really depends. You can sometimes you have you would have a warm current, and sometimes you might have a cold current. And so if your body of land, let's say this is some land right here, if you have a body of land and a warm current goes by, then that's going to make the place nearby warm. And if you've got something that's cold, this is your body of land right here, and that cold substance, that cold current is going to make an area cold. And so it can affect the temperature of the region. It can actually affect the moisture as well. So this is a pretty good chart to help us understand this. So let's now talk about latitude and climate and then show another quick video clip.
Well, latitude affects climate in terms of circulation, where the major wind bands are by latitudinal differences. Around the equator, you have a wind band known as the trade winds, which primarily blow from the east to the west. As you move either north or south off from the equator, then you get into the wind bands known as the prevailing westerlies, where we are right now. And that controls most of the weather because it moves the weather, as the name implies, from the west to the east. So it's opposite of what you get around the equator with the trade winds. As we move even farther north towards the poles, well, then it switches back again. You get the polar easterlies, where the winds again move from the east to the west. And this is all set up by atmospheric circulation and turnover of the atmosphere, causing the surface winds to go in the different directions. So the movement of the weather systems is controlled by these bigger wind belts and these bigger wind patterns that you see, and they're symmetrical around the equator. You have the tropical winds, the trade winds, both north and south, right near the equator, then the westerlies a little farther on both sides, and the polar easterlies towards both poles.
Okay, I hope that was clear on what you're learning. Okay, let's talk about temperature and climate. Here's the latitude thing. I think this is somewhat clear. Of course, if you look here, the warmest spots are at the equator there with a deep red color. And then when you look at the North Pole up there, it, of course, is very blue. You can look at the temperature and how cold it is. And so that kind of gives you a picture of kind of how that works. That's a pretty cool graphic if you want. So latitude and temperature. And here's another way to look at it. Actually, here's the sea surface temperature. Now this makes sense. You get 30-degree temperature right here, kind of at the equator right here, right? This equator is kind of roughly right there. And of course, at the poles, you get the purple water, which is very cold. You see that. Okay? Temperature and climate. We also can talk here, altitude and climate. I should say altitude right here. what happens here at sea level, it might say be 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, and then if you go to 4,000 feet, 78, 8,000 feet, 66, and of course where we live here in Woodland Park, we live at about 8,500 feet. And the further you go up, how that affects the climate. It gets colder. And notice even here, at the sea level, if you've got a mountain that starts at sea level and goes up to, say, 20,000 feet, and there are places in the world that do this, you would have a tropical rainforest at the beach. And up here, it's going to be cold and like snowy and tundra-like. And we're not going to get into details of all the different climatic zones, although they're very cool, but we will